In this video, we are going to be looking at the inferior mesenteric artery. But before we do, let's have an overall recap on the blood supply to the abdomen based on its embryological formation. The gut tube is divided into three parts. First we have the foregut, followed by the midgut, and finally we have the hindgut. On this image you can see that I have included a large artery that runs down the posterior abdominal wall. This is the abdominal aorta. The aorta supplies the fore, the mid and the hind through three separate branches. Supplying the foregut, we have the celiac trunk. The midgut is supplied by the superior mesenteric artery, and the hindgut is supplied by the inferior mesenteric artery. In this more detailed schematic, we can see that the celiac trunk supplies the stomach, liver, spleen, the proximal duodenum, and most of the pancreas. The superior mesenteric artery supplies some of the pancreas, the distal duodenum, the small intestine, and the ascending and most of the transverse colon. Whilst the inferior mesenteric picks up where the superior mesenteric left off, supplying the last quarter of the transverse colon, the descending, and the sigmoid colon. There is a really good mnemonic for remembering the branches of the aorta. That is, canned soup, really good in cans. From top to bottom, we have the celiac trunk, the superior mesenteric artery, the renal arteries, the gonadal arteries, the inferior mesenteric artery, and lastly, the common iliac artery. But as this can seem a little daunting, let us focus our efforts on the inferior mesenteric artery as promised. On this image, we have unravelled the small and large intestine, and we have pushed the small intestine over here to the patient's right so we could get a clearer image of the abdominal aorta and the inferior mesenteric artery. We also know that the superior mesenteric artery supplies the branches to the small intestine, so we don't need to focus on that part of the gut. So let's orient ourselves with some labels. We have the cecum. The appendix is hidden by the small intestine, so we follow the cecum with the ascending colon. This terminates at the hepatic flexure, and we have the transverse colon that follows, terminating at the splenic flexure, before we get to the descending colon, the sigmoid, and the rectum. These latter three will be the focus of our tutorial. We also have the inferior mesenteric artery of the abdominal aorta. This branch is the final branch of the abdominal aorta before it bifurcates to produce the common iliac arteries that enter the pelvis. So let's move on and look at the branches of the inferior mesenteric artery. The first branch of the inferior mesenteric is the left colic branch. This forms a superior and an inferior branch. We're going to look at the superior now. The superior branch of the inferior mesenteric artery anastomoses around the splenic flexure, with the middle colic artery from the superior mesenteric artery. This anastomosis forms the marginal artery, which provides the circulation to the last part of the transverse colon and the first part of the descending colon. The inferior branch of the left colic artery does exactly what it says on the tin and moves inferiorly to anastomose with the sigmoid arteries, supplying the distal part of the descending colon. We will follow this with the sigmoid arteries that we know anastomose superiorly with the inferior branch of the left colic artery. These arteries travel within the mesentery of the sigmoid colon, the sigmoid mesocolon, to supply the sigmoid. The mesentery allows this part of the colon to be highly mobile, which is why so many collateral circulations are needed to this part of the colon. So the sigmoid colon also receives blood supply from the final branch, the superior rectal artery. The superior rectal artery supplies the portion of the rectum and anastomoses with the sigmoid arteries for collateral circulation of the sigmoid colon. Let's summarise what we have learnt about the inferior mesenteric artery. We know that the inferior mesenteric artery supplies the hindgut. The distal transverse colon is supplied by the left colic artery, more specifically the superior branch of the left colic artery, which anastomoses with the middle colic artery to form the marginal artery. The descending colon is supplied by the left colic artery via the inferior and superior branches. The sigmoid is supplied by the sigmoid arteries. And finally, the rectum, which is supplied by the superior rectal artery from the inferior mesenteric artery. It is worth noting that further branches from the internal iliac artery, one of the branches from the common iliac artery, also supply the rectum inferiorly. These are called the inferior rectal arteries. You can help yourself to learn the blood supply to the abdomen by modelling these patterns or the course of the vessels with pipe cleaners or strawberry lacers. Additionally, creating a flowchart will help you actively engage with this series of videos to give you a comprehensive understanding of the blood supply to the gastrointestinal tract.